the med scanner hummed a low rhythmic chord that seemed to vibrate against Lyra's very bones. Commander Jax Thorne didn't pull away when the device flashed red, signaling the supposed defect that had made her a pariah among her own kind. Instead, he stepped closer, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her wrist. It was a terrifying, electric proximity. He wasn't disgusted. He was focused. Arrogance had blinded an empire to her worth, but this man's stubbornness was looking for a way to save a princess. Truth is, Lyra had spent 20 years waiting for the floor to open up and swallow her. In the Astrea hegemony, you were either a symphony of biological perfection or you were background noise. Lyra was the latter, a glitch in the royal bloodline, a princess whose internal chemistry refused to align with the high-frequency resonance of her people. To her father, Archon Valerius, she was a diplomatic embarrassment, a legacy discarded before it could even begin. The transfer had been clinical. No long goodbyes, no tears, just the cold metallic chime of the Zenith Station docking clamps releasing. Valerius had looked at Jax Thorne, a man whose uniform smelled of old coffee and atmospheric re-entry, and handed over his daughter as if she were a diplomatic gift to the unrefined Terran reach. He'd used the word trash without saying it, his eyes lingering on her with the kind of pity that feels like a physical weight. But Jax hadn't played the part of the grateful recipient. He'd simply grunted, checked the seal on his flight suit, and gestured toward the battered transport ship. The journey to the Terran world of Gaia was a blur of recycled air, and the constant low-level vibration of engines that sounded like they were arguing with physics. Lyra stayed in her quarters, bracing for the inevitable moment the primitives would realize she was broken. She expected mockery. She expected the same cold distance she'd known in the hegemony. Ironically, it was a cup of tea that broke the wall. Jax had come in 3 days out from Zenith. He didn't bow. He didn't use her titles. He just sat on the edge of the small, bolted-down table and pushed a steaming mug toward her. His hands were thick-fingered and calloused, a sharp contrast to the spindly, delicate limbs of the Astrea elite. They called her trash back home, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble that seemed to settle in her chest. But out here, we don't have much use for perfect. We look for what works. Lyra reached for the mug, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through her, not the painful discordance she usually felt when touching her own kind, but a strange, grounding warmth. It was as if her body, so long out of tune with the hegemony, had finally found a frequency it recognized. In fact, she felt more alive in that cramped, vibrating cabin than she ever had in the crystalline palaces of her birth. But the fear remained. She was a biological failure, a girl whose heart beat to a rhythm no one else could follow. And then they landed on Gaia. The world wasn't a sterile grid of silver and glass. It was a riot of green and gold, a place where the wild grass grew tall and the air tasted of salt and rain. As Lyra stepped off the ramp, the planet seemed to reach out for her. Her knees buckled, not from weakness, but from an overwhelming surge of sensory input. Her blood felt like it was catching fire, her pulse racing in a way that should have been fatal. Jax was there before she hit the dirt. His arms were a solid, unyielding heat around her. "Easy," he muttered, pulling her against his chest. "I've got you." The most dangerous thing in the galaxy is a Terran with a medical scanner and a point to prove, and as the medics rushed forward, Lyra realized her revolution was about to be born in the dirt of a primitive world. The screen didn't flash red this time. It glowed a steady, deep amber. Jax's hand was a heavy, reassuring warmth against her shoulder as the Terran medic looked up with a grin that was half wonder and half spite. It wasn't a defect. It was a bridge. Lyra felt the frantic rhythm of her heart finally sync with the low, steady thrum of the man beside her. For the first time in her life, the static in her blood fell silent, replaced by a clarity that tasted like oxygen after a lifetime of drowning. It turned out the hegemony's obsession with purity had been their undoing. They had spent millennia scrubbing the noise from their DNA, pruning away the messy, biological heat that defined life in its rawest form. They thought Lyra was broken because she possessed a dormant trait in ancient receptor that required a specific, intense biochemical frequency to wake up. Specifically, she needed the presence of a species that still carried the fire of evolution in their veins. She didn't need a cure. She needed a partner. In the months that followed, the labs on Gaia became a sanctuary rather than a prison. Jax was always there, a constant presence in the periphery of her vision. He didn't treat her like a fragile porcelain doll or a political pawn. He treated her like a woman who was discovering she had wings, and in the quiet hours of the Terran night, when the smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine filled the air, the distance between them evaporated. It wasn't just about science anymore. It was about the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with a fierce, protective kind of awe. But the hegemony couldn't stay in the dark forever. The return to Zenith Station was different this time. The docking clamps didn't groan. They seemed to shiver under the weight of the Terran fleet flanking Lyra's ship. When the airlock hissed open, Lyra didn't walk with the bowed head of a discarded princess. She stood tall, her hand resting protectively over the slight curve of her stomach, where a new kind of life-y union of two worlds was already beginning to beat. Archon Valerius was waiting in the High Council chamber, his face a mask of silver-cold indifference. He looked at Jax with disdain, then at his daughter with a flicker of confusion. He expected a plea for readmission. He expected a broken girl. Instead, Lyra stepped into the center of the room. The air around her seemed to shimmer, a golden resonance that made the nearby Estrella guards stumble as their own systems tried to harmonize with her newfound strength. "You called me trash," she said, her voice steady and echoing through the vaulted hall. "But you were just looking at a lock you didn't have the key to." Jax stepped up beside her, his hand sliding into hers. The contact sparked a visible ripple of energy, a warm light that pushed back the sterile shadows of the chamber. "The most dangerous thing in the galaxy is a Terran with a point to prove," Jax added, his eyes locked on the Archon. "And we've got a whole planet of people who are tired of being told they're unrefined." Cognitive diversity wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a living, breathing reality in Lyra's womb. The hegemony's medical hubris crumbled in the face of the data she brought back, the proof that their species was dying of its own perfection. They needed the wild grass of Gaia to survive. A legacy discarded became a revolution born. Lyra didn't take the throne. She didn't seek revenge. Instead, she helped found a healing guild that bridged the gap between the crystalline stars and the muddy earth, a place where medicine wasn't about fixing a flaw, but about finding the connection that made a soul whole. And as she looked out at the stars from the Zenith observation deck, Jax's arm around her waist, she realized that stubbornness hadn't just saved a princess, it had saved the galaxy. "Would you like me to generate a cinematic image of Lyra and Jax standing on the observation deck of Zenith Station?"